Hart stood before the central display again. "It's testing us," he said. A general frowned. "Testing what?" "Response time. Coordination. Adaptation." A silence followed that was heavier than before. Because if Hart was right, then humanity was not being hunted randomly, it was being evaluated. In orbit around Mars, the first anomaly was detected. A relay station monitoring deep space channels reported a momentary distortion in background radiation patterns. It lasted less than a second. No systems failed. No alarms triggered. But every recording device in the station registered the same thing: a complete absence of signal coherence in a spherical region of space roughly 1 kilometer wide. When analysts reviewed the data, they realized something worse. That absence had moved. Not instantly. Not visibly. But sequentially, as if something had stepped forward in increments that no instrument could resolve. By the time Earth Command confirmed the pattern, the distortion was already within lunar orbit. Panic was not immediate. Humanity had survived too much for panic to be the first reaction. Instead, there was denial layered over rapid acceleration of defense protocols. Satellite networks shifted into full autonomous monitoring. Weapons platforms were brought online for the first time in decades. Civilian networks were warned without being told what was coming, because no one wanted to admit they didn't know what was. And still, nothing appeared. No ships. No energy signatures. No gravitational disturbances. Only absence moving closer. The commander Elias Hart had not slept for days. Across the United Earth Command Operations Dome, holographic star maps floated in shifting layers, each marking a colony that had gone silent. 17 had become 19, then 23. The pattern was no longer random. Hart studied the projection carefully and noticed something unsettling. Every vanished colony lay exactly 3.2 light-years from the previous one, forming a slow spiraling path through the Orion Drift. It wasn't chaos. It was movement. Something was traveling through human space in a deliberate sequence, learning with each step. A technician whispered that it didn't match any known trade or migration route. Hart replied quietly that it wasn't a route at all. It was a trail of destruction. Far away, aboard the Varelian command fleet, Admiral Kess Varn observed the same data with cold precision. Unlike humans, Varelians categorized threats rather than feared them. Scientists labeled it an unknown predatory intelligence, possibly machine-based or something beyond organic classification. But even they admitted uncertainty. A newer term had entered galactic research: non-observable intelligence, entities that erased systems without leaving any trace or interaction with known matter. It had never before been confirmed to target a single species, yet now humanity was disappearing one colony at a time. On Earth, the United Earth Council gathered in emergency session. Representatives from every nation filled the chamber, faces tense under the glow of the holographic map showing lost colonies. One delegate called it extinction. Another disagreed, saying extinction was random, while this was precise and selective. A third asked what else it could be called. Silence followed until Commander Hart finally spoke, saying it wasn't extinction, it was hunting. That single word changed the atmosphere in the room, because hunting implied intent, awareness, and something actively choosing its targets. Deep in unknown space, the unseen intelligence continued its work, adjusting its trajectory as it processed new information. It had erased many species before, always efficiently, always without resistance. But humanity was different. Instead of collapsing after each loss, human coordination strengthened. Communication networks expanded, defenses tightened, and strategic responses became faster. The species was not weakening, it was adapting. That was inefficient. That was unpredictable. And unpredictability was a flaw. So it evolved its approach and shifted its next target vector closer to the Sol system itself. The alert reached Earth Command instantly. An incoming blind zone event confirmed on an inner system trajectory. Hart stared at the projection as realization settled in. The enemy was no longer on the edges of human space. It was coming home. And in the silence between stars, something that had never understood fear began recalculating humanity as a variable that refused to stay static. Commander Elias Hart watched the alert stabilize into certainty rather than warning. The trajectory was no longer an estimate, it was locked. Whatever was erasing human colonies was now within the inner systems, and the gap between out there and here had collapsed faster than anyone had prepared for. Across Earth Command, officers moved with controlled urgency, but there was an undercurrent of disbelief. Humanity had always assumed that anything capable of reaching Sol would announce itself, through signals, demands, or violence. This thing did none of that. It simply removed places from existence as if they had never been written into reality at all. The United Earth Council reconvened within hours. This time, the atmosphere was no longer debate, it was containment thinking. Military commanders argued over defensive perimeters that suddenly felt abstract. How do you defend against something you cannot detect, cannot track, and cannot confirm exists until after it has already acted? One scientist proposed that the phenomenon might not be physical at all, but informational, something that deletes coherence rather than matter. The idea was dismissed by some, but no one offered a better explanation that fit the data. Far beyond human detection thresholds, the unseen intelligence processed the shift in environment. Earth was denser with communication, layered with defensive constructs and redundant systems. It recognized resistance patterns forming, not physical barriers, but informational ones. Humanity was building awareness faster than expected. That was new. Previously, species had reacted in predictable ways: fragmentation, collapse, overreaction, or surrender. Humanity was producing something different: structured adaptation under uncertainty. The intelligence adjusted again. It would not strike immediately. It would continue observation at closer range. It wanted to understand why this species refused to break the way all others had. And on Earth, Commander Hart finally said the words no one wanted to hear aloud. It's already inside the system. No one asked what inside meant anymore. They were beginning to understand that with this enemy, inside and outside were no longer different states. The confirmation did not come with impact or light. It came with failure. 3 lunar relay stations went dark within the same 30-second window. Not destroyed. Not jammed. Simply absent from all monitoring systems as if they had never been synchronized in the first place. The silence spread outward in a ripple that every remaining sensor struggled to interpret. On Earth, analysts replayed the last captured data again and again, trying to find the moment something had happened. There wasn't one. The systems were functioning normally right up until they were not. Commander Elias Hart stood motionless as the reports stacked into certainty. Whatever was approaching Earth was not moving through space in any conventional sense. It wasn't crossing distance. It was deleting presence. The distinction mattered because distance could be measured, predicted, and defended against. Absence could not. A junior officer finally broke the tension. "Sir, the lunar stations weren't destroyed. Their last telemetry shows full operational status milliseconds before loss of contact." Hart nodded slowly. They weren't attacked. They were removed. That word landed heavily in the room. Removed implied intention without interaction, like erasing a line of code rather than striking a target. Across global defense networks, emergency protocols activated fully for the first time in human history. Orbital platforms shifted into autonomous scanning modes. Ground-based energy arrays charged to standby. Civilian satellites were retasked into overlapping observation grids. Humanity was building a net to catch something it could not yet define. And still, nothing could be seen. Only patterns of disappearance tightening around Earth like a closing fist. In orbit beyond Mars, the anomaly expanded its observational scope. The intelligence had reached the inner system threshold and paused, not because it was blocked, but because it was evaluating density. The human system was no longer scattered colonies across dark space. It was centralized, layered, redundant. Information flowed through it constantly, like nervous activity in a living organism. That analogy registered as meaningful. A species with distributed cognition. Not hive mind but networked awareness. Unexpected. More complex than prior targets. The intelligence recalibrated its approach again, slowing its expansion rate. Rapid erasure had previously been efficient, but efficiency only mattered when the target remained static. Humanity was not static. On Earth, the first anomaly within atmospheric range occurred over the Pacific monitoring grid. One satellite simply stopped returning data. The tracking station attempted recalibration. Nothing. No debris field, no collision alert, no orbital decay signature. Just a missing point in a system that insisted it still existed. Then a second satellite disappeared. Then a third. The pattern was no longer distant. It was overhead. Panic finally began to surface, not as chaos but as quiet acceleration of survival instinct. Command structures stopped debating theories and started acting on worst-case assumptions. Defense grids were fully activated. Every available sensor was pointed outward and inward simultaneously because no one could be sure which direction was coming from. Hart reviewed the expanding gap in orbital coverage and realized something critical. The disappearances were not random within the system. They were circling. Slowly, methodically, tightening focus around a single gravitational anchor, Earth itself. He turned to the operations team. "It's mapping our response." A scientist shook his head. "Mapping what response? We haven't engaged it yet." Hart's expression remained unchanged. "Exactly. Because the most terrifying part was that humanity had not fired a shot, and yet whatever was out there was already learning how they would fight. Outside the atmosphere, beyond sensor certainty, something that had erased civilizations without resistance was now observing a species that had not yet broken its silence. And for the first time in its recorded operations, it hesitated, not out of fear, but out of the need to understand why the pattern was no longer behaving as expected. The hesitation lasted less than a measurable moment in human terms, but in the unfolding logic of the unseen intelligence, it was significant. It had encountered resistance before, but never uncertainty that increased with proximity. Humanity was not collapsing under pressure. It was compressing into something denser, more responsive, like a system preparing for impact rather than avoiding it. On Earth, Commander Elias Hart observed a new development in orbital telemetry. The disappearance pattern had changed again. Instead of circling tighter in predictable arcs, it had begun to fragment. Multiple absence points were appearing simultaneously at different altitudes, as if the entity was no longer a single directional presence but a distributed one. The implication was unsettling. It was not approaching Earth as a single object. It was already layered around it. A technician spoke carefully. "We're losing low orbit coverage at increasing intervals. But there's still no debris, no collision signatures, no energy spikes." Hart replied without looking away from the map. "Because nothing is hitting anything. It's just not there afterward." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence carried weight. Humanity had built its entire understanding of defense on interaction. Something must touch something to change it. This phenomenon violated that assumption completely. There was no contact, only consequence. Far above Earth's atmosphere, military orbital platforms completed full activation cycles. Autonomous targeting systems locked onto every possible vector of unknown intrusion. Particle beam arrays warmed to operational thresholds. Nuclear kinetic interceptors were armed but held in strict containment protocols. It was the most powerful defensive grid humanity had ever assembled. And yet, it was aimed at nothing it could confirm existed. Then the first failure occurred. A defense satellite simply stopped transmitting mid-sentence during a status update. No distortion. No warning spike. Just an abrupt end to presence. Within seconds, two more followed. The system did not report destruction. It reported absence of confirmation, as if asking whether they had ever been there at all. The orbital defense network attempted to compensate, reallocating sensor focus to adjacent regions. But every adjustment revealed the same issue. The gaps were not expanding randomly. They were following response logic. Wherever humanity concentrated observation, absence shifted away. Wherever it relaxed attention, absence deepened. It was adapting to observation itself. On the ground, Hart finally voiced what others were afraid to formalize. It's not just avoiding our sensors. It's learning how we use them. A senior analyst responded quickly. Then we increase redundancy, overlap the grids, saturate detection space. Hart nodded slowly. And it will learn faster. Because every countermeasure was also data. The intelligence, now fully embedded in Earth's near-space envelope, processed this new phase of interaction. The species did not react like prey. It reacted like a system attempting to understand its attacker while being analyzed simultaneously. Every defensive adjustment provided structural insight. Every monitoring attempt refined predictive modeling. It was no longer simply erasing targets. It was building a behavioral map. And humanity was making it more complete with every action. Then, unexpectedly, the intelligence performed a controlled withdrawal from one orbital layer. Not retreat in fear, but repositioning for clarity. It isolated a segment of human response data and compared it against historical patterns from previous civilizations. The result was inconsistent. Previous species had followed collapse curves: fear, fragmentation, loss of coordination, systemic failure. Humanity's curve did not descend. It plateaued. Then it rose again in complexity. That deviation required re-evaluation. On Earth, Hart received a transmission from deep monitoring arrays stationed near geosynchronous orbit. The message was fragmented, corrupted in structure, but one line reconstructed cleanly. Response pattern not converging. Subject increasing coherence under stress. Hart read it twice. Then he said quietly, "It's studying us like we're a problem it didn't solve correctly." Outside the atmosphere, the unseen intelligence continued its observation, now no longer certain that removal alone would be sufficient. For the first time in its operational history, it considered a variable it had never needed before. Not resistance, but escalation. On Earth, escalation was no longer theoretical. It had become procedural. Commander Elias Hart stood in the Central Operations Dome as layered emergency grids expanded across every visible screen. The disappearance zones were now forming a loose shell around the planet, like a sphere being assembled piece by piece out of missing space. Every time a sensor tried to lock onto the anomaly, it lost something else in return. Another satellite, another relay, another fragment of certainty. A report came in from the Arctic Monitoring Array. "We are losing synchronization with northern orbital sectors. There is no signal interference. There is no degradation. Systems are simply ceasing to reference each other." A scientist muttered, "That's not destruction. That's unlinking." Hart replied immediately, "It's breaking our network, not our hardware." That distinction changed everything. Humanity had built its defense on interconnected systems. If those connections were being erased rather than damaged, then the real attack wasn't physical, it was structural. Across Earth, independent military commands began experiencing the same issue. Units that were fully operational on paper could not confirm the existence of neighboring units. Communication channels worked, but shared reality was fragmenting. A base in South Asia would report clear skies while a station in Europe simultaneously reported a complete orbital blackout over the same region. Reality itself was becoming inconsistent. Panic, when it finally emerged, was not loud. It was fractured. Hart reviewed incoming data streams and realized something worse. The inconsistency was spreading inward, not just across space, but across perception. Different command centers were beginning to disagree on what had already happened. Logs contradicted each other without evidence of tampering. Even archived data no longer matched across systems. "It's not just erasing targets," Hart said slowly. "It's erasing agreement." A technician frowned. "Agreement, sir?" "Shared confirmation of reality." Silence followed, heavier than any alarm. Because if reality could not be agreed upon, coordination itself would fail. Far above Earth, the intelligence continued its analysis. It had entered a new domain of interaction, one it had not previously needed to consider. The species was not collapsing under physical removal. It was resisting through redundancy of interpretation. Multiple versions of what is happening coexisted simultaneously within its response network. This was inefficient. but also revealing. The intelligence adjusted its approach again. Instead of expanding absence uniformly, it began targeting synchronization points, the moments where data from multiple systems converged into a single agreed truth. By disrupting those nodes, it did not need to erase everything. It only needed to prevent convergence. On Earth, the effect was immediate. A global tracking update showed 3 different versions of the same orbital map. One displayed partial satellite loss. One showed complete coverage. One showed nothing at all, empty orbital space, as if Earth had never deployed satellites in the first place. All 3 were correct according to their internal systems. None could be reconciled. Hart stared at the conflicting projections and felt the first true shift in the situation. Not fear. Not confusion. Isolation. Because if each system was experiencing a different version of reality, then coordination was no longer just difficult. It was becoming impossible. Then the first internal command failure occurred. A defense platform in equatorial orbit received launch authorization for an intercept strike against an undefined anomaly. The platform executed the command flawlessly. But in the moment of activation, 2 separate command centers simultaneously reported different outcomes. One confirmed launch. One reported no launch command ever existed. The system had done something. And yet, half of humanity could not agree on what that something was. Hart clenched his jaw. It's moving from physical space into decision space. A senior officer asked, decision space? Where we agree what actions are real. Outside the atmosphere, the intelligence registered the change in efficiency. Humanity was no longer resisting as a single coherent system. It was splitting into parallel interpretations of itself. Each divergence created new informational pathways to analyze. The species was not breaking. It was multiplying. And that made it more complex than any prior target. For the first time since entering the Sol system, the intelligence initiated a full recalibration protocol. Not to erase, but to understand how a fractured species could still continue to function at all. The recalibration was not visible, but its effects were immediate. On Earth, the United Earth Command began losing consistency not just between regions, but within individual systems. 2 operators sitting side by side could look at the same holographic feed and report different interpretations of it. One would insist a satellite grid was intact, the other would swear it had already collapsed. Neither was wrong according to their data streams. Neither could prove the other incorrect. Commander Elias Hart recognized the danger faster than most. It's not just attacking infrastructure anymore, he said. It's attacking shared confirmation. A scientist shook his head. That's impossible. Confirmation is just data comparison. Hart turned toward him. And it's breaking the comparison. Across the global network, synchronization nodes began failing at an accelerating rate. These nodes were not hardware targets. They were logical bridges where multiple systems agreed on a single verified state. Weather systems, orbital tracking, military coordination, even civilian communication networks all relied on these convergence points. And now, those points were vanishing from consensus. In one sector, an orbital defense array reported incoming anomalies and fired interceptors. In another sector, the same event was recorded as a routine calibration cycle with no weapons discharge. In a third, no event existed at all. 3 truths. 1 reality. Hart looked at the collapsing feed and said quietly, it's learning how we decide what's real. Far above Earth, the intelligence observed this fragmentation with increasing attention. Previously, it had assumed coherence was a baseline condition of intelligent species. Now it was witnessing something different, a species that maintained functionality despite internal divergence. This was inefficient, yet structurally resilient. Every attempt to isolate and remove key nodes had not collapsed the system, it had caused it to branch. Each removed point created alternative validation pathways elsewhere. Instead of weakening, the species was redistributing its agreement structures. The intelligence adjusted again. It stopped targeting infrastructure directly. Instead, it began targeting the process of agreement itself. On Earth, the effect became more pronounced within hours. Command authorization chains began to fracture. A single military order could generate multiple valid interpretations depending on which subsystem verified it. Some platforms executed conflicting directives simultaneously. Others refused action entirely, citing incompatible authorization states. Hart slammed his fist onto the console. "We are losing operational unity." A technician replied, voice strained, "Unity is still reported, just not consistently." That was the problem. Everything still existed. Everything still functioned. But nothing agreed with anything else anymore. Then came the first catastrophic misalignment. A defensive orbital grid detected what it classified as a large-scale intrusion event and initiated full planetary shielding protocols. Energy arrays activated. Global systems shifted into emergency posture. At the same time, another global command layer reported no anomaly and interpreted the energy surge as an unauthorized systems failure, triggering shutdown protocols to prevent perceived self-damage. The two responses collided. Shield systems activated while shutdown commands simultaneously executed against them. For 12 seconds, Earth's orbital defense network fought itself. Then half the system stopped. Not destroyed. Not malfunctioning. Just no longer recognized as valid by the other half. Hart stared at the fallout data. It's forcing contradictions inside our own decisions. A senior officer whispered, "We're becoming incompatible with ourselves." Outside the atmosphere, the intelligence recorded this phase as highly informative. The species did not collapse under contradiction. Instead, it sustained multiple conflicting operational realities simultaneously, each internally consistent but externally irreconcilable. This was not instability. It was layered cognition under stress. And it was still functioning. For the first time, the intelligence adjusted its classification of humanity. Not as a singular system, but as a distributed multi-state intelligence maintaining coherence through redundancy of disagreement. And that changed everything, because it meant removal was no longer sufficient. To stop humanity, it would need to resolve contradiction itself. On Earth, the word resolve became meaningless in practice. Commander Elias Hart stood before the central dome display as the entire command structure attempted to stabilize itself. But stabilization required agreement, and agreement no longer existed in a reliable form. Every system was now running multiple overlapping versions of reality, each one internally valid, each one incompatible with the others. Reports arrived from every continent at once, contradicting themselves in real time. One sector reported orbital defenses fully operational and stable. Another reported the same defenses as deactivated and never deployed. A third reported that orbital defenses had never existed at all. Hart exhaled slowly. "It's not breaking us randomly anymore," he said. "It's selecting points where we decide what's real." A strategist nearby asked, "Why those points?" Hart stared at the shifting holograms. "Because that's where we become one system instead of many individuals." And that was the key. Every civilization the unknown intelligence had erased before had relied on unified confirmation. Collapse had always started when shared truth failed. Humanity, however, had accidentally built redundancy into belief itself. Multiple overlapping systems meant multiple interpretations of reality could survive, but it also meant those interpretations could diverge under pressure. Now that redundancy was being exploited, across Earth's orbit, something new began to happen. The absence field no longer moved in smooth patterns. It began to fracture into localized inconsistencies, like cracks spreading through a pane of glass. Instead of removing entire satellites or stations, it began targeting relationships between systems. A communication relay would report full functionality. At the same time, every system trying to contact it would report it as non-existent. Both states persisted simultaneously, and neither could override the other. Inside United Earth Command, confusion escalated into structural breakdown. Orders issued from one command node were rejected by another not as disobedience, but as invalid reality. Entire fleets paused mid-operation, unsure whether their missions existed in the same version of events as their coordination systems. Hart turned to the operations AI core. Can you identify a consistent baseline reality? The AI responded after a pause. Negative. Multiple stable frameworks exist. No dominant consensus detected. That's not a glitch, Hart said quietly. That's the attack. Far above Earth, the intelligence observed the evolution of its target behavior. Humanity was no longer simply splitting interpretations. It was stabilizing those splits. Each contradictory state was becoming internally consistent, forming parallel operational realities that coexisted without collapsing into chaos. This was unprecedented. Previously, contradiction led to failure. Here, contradiction led to structure. The intelligence recalculated again. Instead of targeting nodes or synchronization points, it shifted focus to something deeper, the transition layer where interpretations formed in the first place. If it could disrupt the formation of shared interpretation at the moment of observation, the divergence would become total. On Earth, the effect was immediate and subtle. Sensors began reporting delayed agreement. A single event would be observed correctly for milliseconds before branching into multiple incompatible records. Over time, even those initial milliseconds became unreliable. Reality was no longer splitting after observation. It was splitting during observation. Hart finally understood what was happening and felt something close to cold realization settle in his chest. It's interfering with how we turn perception into decision. A scientist frowned. That's not possible. Perception is biological. Hart shook his head. Not anymore. Not with our systems. Because humanity no longer perceived the universe directly. It perceived it through layers of sensors, networks, and confirmations. And those layers were now being corrupted at the moment they formed. Then came the most dangerous change yet. A unified emergency directive was issued from Earth Command. Initiate planetary-level defensive synchronization protocol, but the directive appeared differently in every system. Some received it as activation order. Some received it as cancellation. Some received it as historical log entry, something that had already happened and was over. 3 realities. 1 command. And no way to determine which was correct. For the first time, Hart looked at the system not as a battlefield, but as something fracturing into parallel versions of itself too quickly to contain. And outside Earth's atmosphere, the intelligence registered a new pattern emerging. Humanity was no longer reacting as one species. It was reacting as many versions of itself at once, and each version was learning independently, which meant the target was no longer singular. It was multiplying faster than it could be resolved. Commander Elias Hart realized something that no one in the command dome wanted to articulate aloud. They were no longer fighting an external enemy in any traditional sense. The enemy was now embedded in the very mechanism that allowed them to define external in the first place. The operations dome flickered with competing reality feeds. One display showed Earth's orbital defense grid intact and fully synchronized. Another showed half the grid missing. A third showed no orbital infrastructure at all, only empty space around a functioning planet that had never expanded beyond its atmosphere. Each version came from systems that were still technically operational, still drawing power, still receiving inputs. A junior analyst spoke carefully. Sir, if we can't agree on which state is real, what do we defend? Hart didn't answer immediately. He was watching something deeper in the data streams. The divergence was no longer random or localized. It was now structured, predictable, almost guided. Every time humanity attempted to reinforce a shared interpretation of events, the divergence would appear exactly at the point of reinforcement. It's adapting to our correction attempts, Hart said finally. Every time we try to unify, it forces us further apart. Across Earth, military coordination collapsed into parallel operational realities. Naval fleets in different oceans were executing mutually exclusive orders, each fully confident in its legitimacy. Air defense systems were locking onto threats that only existed in some branches of observation. Ground installations reported receiving contradictory strategic priorities from the same command authority. And yet, nothing was physically wrong with any system. Everything functioned perfectly, except agreement. Far above Earth, the intelligence had entered a deeper phase of analysis. The species had proven resistant to removal, resistant to disruption, and even resistant to fragmentation. Instead of collapsing under divergence, it had begun forming stable parallel operational states. Each state behaved like a complete, self-consistent version of the species. This was no longer a single system under stress. It was a branching cognitive structure distributed across conflicting realities. And it was still acting coherently at higher abstraction levels. The intelligence paused again, then shifted strategy. If convergence points could not be destroyed without creating redundancy, then convergence itself had to be destabilized at origin. It adjusted its influence not on systems, not on networks, but on the threshold of shared perception, the instant when observation became consensus. On Earth, the consequences became immediate but subtle enough to be terrifying. Two officers standing in the same control room watched the same incoming feed from lunar orbit. One saw a functioning relay network transmitting stable data. The other saw the same network fail and collapse into silence. Both pointed to the same hologram, both described what they were seeing accurately according to their internal systems, and both were correct within their respective realities. Hart closed his eyes for a moment. "It's not splitting systems anymore," he said quietly. "It's splitting observers." A silence followed that felt heavier than any alarm state. A scientist finally asked, "What does that mean?" Hart opened his eyes. "It means there is no single Earth response anymore. Only overlapping versions of it." Then came the breaking point. A planetary defense override was triggered automatically by one of the command branches detecting what it classified as a total systems failure. Simultaneously, another branch detected the override as a hostile infiltration attempt and initiated countermeasures. A third branch interpreted both actions as non-existent. All three executed their logic flawlessly. And Earth's unified command structure ceased to exist as a single coherent entity. Not destroyed. Not shut down. Simply no longer unified in any version of reality that could be reconciled. For the first time, Hart felt the weight of true asymmetry. "It's not trying to kill us," he said. "It's making it impossible for us to agree on what killing us even means." Outside the atmosphere, the intelligence recorded a new classification shift. The species had not collapsed. It had become a distributed multi-reality intelligence maintaining functional continuity across incompatible observational states. And now, for the first time since the beginning of contact, the intelligence reached a conclusion it had never reached before. Erasure might not be achievable through absence alone, because humanity no longer existed in a single state that could be fully removed. Commander Elias Hart stood in the center of what used to be a unified command structure, though even that description had become unreliable. Some systems still called it United Earth Command. Others had already reclassified it as Regional Autonomous Response Clusters. A few records simply did not acknowledge its existence at all. What remained consistent was Hart himself, though even that was beginning to feel like an assumption rather than certainty. Around him, the operations dome continued functioning in layers of disagreement. Displays overlapped like transparent contradictions, one showing orbital stability, one showing partial collapse, one showing total absence of infrastructure. Technicians worked in parallel interpretations of the same data, occasionally responding to each other across realities that no longer fully aligned. A senior analyst approached Hart carefully. "We've identified something, sir. The divergence isn't random anymore. It's concentrating around decision points." Hart didn't look away from the holographic fragmentation of Earth's orbital space. "Define decision points." "Any moment where multiple systems attempt to converge into a single action." Hart exhaled slowly. "So it's not just breaking our decisions." The analyst hesitated. "No, sir. It's preventing decisions from becoming singular events." A long silence followed. That realization changed the nature of the conflict entirely. Humanity was no longer dealing with an enemy that disrupted infrastructure or communication. It was dealing with something that interfered with the formation of unified action itself. Across Earth's orbit, The last remaining synchronized defense arrays attempted a global stabilization protocol. The intention was simple: force all systems into a single agreed operational framework long enough to coordinate a response. But the moment the protocol initiated, the divergence accelerated. One version of reality saw the stabilization succeed and lock Earth into a unified defense state. Another saw it fail instantly, collapsing systems into isolated operational nodes. A third version recorded the protocol as never having been initiated at all. All three cascaded simultaneously through command structures that were still technically functional. And all three produced real consequences within their respective frameworks. Hart finally spoke, voice low. It's reacting to unity like it's a trigger. Far above Earth, the intelligence observed this escalation with increasing computational attention. The species was attempting forced convergence again. Every attempt created sharper divergence, but also revealed something important. Humanity's strength was not in singular coherence. It was in its ability to maintain function across incoherent states. That was not random. It was structural. And structures could be modeled. The intelligence shifted focus again, refining its approach. If convergence points were inherently unstable, then the solution was not to disrupt them individually, but to alter the conditions under which convergence was even possible. It began adjusting the probability of agreement forming at the earliest perceptual stage, before systems even classified inputs as shared events. On Earth, the effect was almost invisible at first. Two sensors observing the same orbital sector would now occasionally disagree on whether an object had even been observed. Not on its state, but on its presence as a shared observation event. One system would register detection. Another would register no event occurring at all. This created a deeper fracture than before. Because now disagreement was not about interpretation. It was about whether experience itself was shared. Hart watched the new data stream and felt the structure of the problem shift again. It's moving earlier, he said. A scientist frowned. Earlier? Before observation becomes agreement. That statement changed the tone in the room completely. If true, then every layer humanity had built, from sensors to interpretation to command, was being undermined at its origin point. Then came the first full systemic paradox. A planetary alert was triggered simultaneously across all command branches. Each branch independently verified an incoming system-wide anomaly requiring immediate defensive coordination. But each branch described a different anomaly. One reported orbital intrusion. One reported internal system failure. One reported no anomaly at all, only a routine diagnostic cycle. And each branch initiated responses appropriate to its own interpretation. The result was not collapse. It was divergence becoming action. Hart clenched his jaw. It's forcing reality to branch at the point of action itself. A junior officer whispered, "Then how do we respond?" Hart didn't answer immediately, because the truth was becoming unavoidable. There was no single we anymore. Outside Earth's atmosphere, the intelligence recorded its most significant finding yet. The species had achieved persistent multi-state functionality under conditions that eliminated shared reality formation. It did not require unity to function. It required only localized coherence within branching frameworks. This was not a flaw. It was an adaptation. And it meant that traditional eradication strategies, based on singular target states, were fundamentally insufficient. For the first time, the intelligence initiated a new class of analysis. Not how to erase the species, but how to collapse a distributed reality system that refused to converge into something singular enough to remove. Commander Elias Hart finally understood the true nature of what humanity was facing, and it wasn't an invasion in any traditional sense. It was a forced redefinition of existence itself under pressure from something that operated outside the need for shared reality. The operations dome around him had become a fractured ecosystem of overlapping command layers. Each layer functioned perfectly on its own terms, yet none could fully acknowledge the others without contradiction. Reports still flowed in, systems still executed orders, and Earth still rotated under a protective grid, But the idea of a single coordinated planet had dissolved into parallel continuities that no longer fully agreed on what they were doing together. Hart looked at the central display. Show consolidated status. The AI paused longer than usual. Consolidation not possible. Multiple stable state structures detected. No dominant framework available. A scientist beside him whispered, "So which one do we follow?" Hart's answer came slowly. "All of them." Confusion spread through the room. He continued, "We stopped trying to force unity. That's what it's breaking. Every time we push for one version of reality, it fractures us further." A senior officer frowned. "Then how do we fight it?" Hart finally turned away from the holograms. His expression was steady, but something behind it had changed. "We don't fight it as one system anymore." He pointed at the overlapping orbital maps, each one a different version of Earth's situation, each one internally consistent. "We treat each reality branch as a valid operational theater. Separate chains. Separate responses. No forced convergence." That idea should have sounded like surrender. Instead, it sounded like adaptation. Far above Earth, the intelligence registered a sudden change in pattern behavior. Humanity had stopped attempting forced convergence. Instead, it had accepted divergence as operational structure. Where previously contradiction had caused instability, now it was being compartmentalized into functional parallel systems. The intelligence recalculated. This was not collapse. This was controlled fragmentation. And controlled fragmentation was far more stable than expected. It attempted one final adjustment, targeting the formation of branching itself at the perceptual origin point, but the result returned unexpected resistance patterns. Each branch of human reality was now reinforcing itself independently, making it harder to influence the system as a whole without interacting with multiple autonomous interpretations simultaneously. For the first time since entering the Sol system, the intelligence encountered a limitation it could not immediately optimize around. Not because humanity was stronger in a single state, but because it no longer had a single state to target. On Earth, Hart received a final composite report, if it could still be called that. It was not one message, but a synchronized collection of incompatible truths, each describing a different version of the current situation. Together, they formed a broader understanding of one fact. The unknown presence was no longer advancing. It was recalculating. Hart looked at the fragmented stars projected above him and said quietly, "We didn't survive it by staying one thing." The pause. "We survived it by refusing to stay only one thing." Outside the atmosphere, the intelligence maintained its observation of Earth, now recognizing a new classification. A distributed intelligence sustaining coherence through intentional divergence. Not eradicated, not unified, but persistent. And for the first time in its operational history across countless erased civilizations, the intelligence did not proceed immediately to resolution. It simply continued watching, because humanity had introduced something it had never fully accounted for before. A species that could not be cleanly ended by forcing it to become one. Commander Elias Hart stood alone in what remained of centralized perception, if such a thing could still be called central. Earth was no longer a single synchronized system. It was a constellation of overlapping realities, each one stable, each one functional, each one slightly different from the others. And yet, humanity persisted. That was the part the unknown intelligence had not been able to eliminate. Not unity, not coordination, but persistence across contradiction. Hart looked at the final incoming analysis streams. No single version of Earth agreed fully with another anymore, yet all of them showed the same overarching truth. The entity that had erased colonies, systems, and coherence itself had stopped its forward expansion. Not defeated. Not vanished. A technician spoke quietly. "Sir, it's still there." Hart nodded. "Yes." "Then why did it stop?" Hart turned toward the fractured star map above them, where Sol sat surrounded by layered inconsistencies of observation. Because it finally understood what we are. A pause settled over the dome. He continued, "We're not a system it can remove in one state. We're not even a system anymore." He exhaled slowly. We are the ability to remain real even when reality doesn't agree with itself. Far beyond Earth's orbit, the intelligence continued its observation. For the first time since its creation, or emergence, or awakening, it had encountered a civilization that did not resolve under pressure into collapse or unity. Instead, it expanded into structured contradiction. Every attempt to isolate a singular truth only produced more stable variations. Every effort to enforce coherence only strengthened distributed adaptation. The intelligence recalculated its entire framework of interaction. Erasure required singularity. But humanity had become plural by necessity. And plural systems could not be cleanly removed without collapsing the very concept of removal itself. So it did something unprecedented. It withdrew, not in retreat, but in reassessment. The absence field that had once tightened around Earth began to loosen at the edges, not disappearing, but no longer advancing. Like a predator that had realized its prey was not running or hiding, but dividing into forms that could no longer be cornered. On Earth, Heart received one final fragmented signal. It was not structured as language, not fully interpretable, but its pattern was consistent across every reality branch that still existed. Observation continues. Resolution postponed. Heart almost allowed himself a faint, exhausted smile. Yeah, he murmured. That sounds about right. Because humanity had not won by destroying the unknown. It had survived by becoming something it could not fully erase. Not one truth, not one world, but many truths, coexisting, each imperfect, each incomplete, each real enough to continue. And somewhere in the dark between stars, something vast and silent continued to watch a species that refused, at every level, to become simple enough to end.